All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and welcome to another TropWATER webinar, lunchtime webinar. Today is extreme weather and climate swings, impacts and challenges across catchments and agricultural loads. I'm Steve Lewis, and with me today is also Jack Koci and Aaron Davis, who are also presenting. Just before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're gathered today. And I know that is a lot of people across probably different parts of Queensland. For me, we're in Bindal country, just to the south of Ross River. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the neighbouring Wallaroo-Kabar people on the northern part of Ross River, and pay my respects to the traditional owners, past and present. I'd just like to let everybody know as well that this session is being recorded and will be available shortly after the conclusion of the seminar on the TropWATER website. And at the end of this collective three presentations today, there will be an open Q&A session. So you can store your questions either in your head, or we encourage you to put them in the chat. And even the presenters can start thinking about your question even as the presentations are still on, and we can address it at the end. If you want to hold your question to the end, though, you can put your hand up and you can be unmuted to ask the question directly as well. Also, at the end of this all these presentations, we'll ask you to do a quick survey on how we can improve these webinars into the future, and have your comments on what you thought went well, and how we can make things better into the future. And finally, before we kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge Emma as well for her massive efforts in getting this together and coordinating the three of us to get things all together and looking nice. And particularly to Emma, who made my slides look very nice today as well. Okay, so this is, you can see, this is also should say this is the first webinar. This is more looking at the extreme weather within the so droughts and floods in the catchment particularly. So I'm going to look at the long-term sort of history of droughts and floods, particularly on a case study of the Burdekin. Then Jack's going to come in and look at the impacts of droughts and floods on catchment condition and sediment erosion and things like that, in particularly the grazing lands. And then Aaron is going to come on at the end and talk about the influence of weather and climate for the cropping areas, particularly in the sugarcane growing areas in North Queensland as well. So this essentially helps showcase some of the work that we and TropWATER are doing. Okay, so I'm starting off with the flooding history in Northern Australia and linkages to the catchment condition. I'd just like to start with the big picture, right? So this is a silo map from 1890 to 2025. So 1890s up here, all the way up to 2025. This is available on the Long Paddock website, a really nice state government product that's produced. And you can see the maps here. So anywhere in the blues are the really big wet years in terms of rainfall. The reds are more the drier years, right? So you can clearly see, these wet periods in the 1970s, also some wet periods in the 1950s and all the way back. But you can see that big flood years in 1973, 74, much of Australia was very, very wet, and our extreme year in 2010, 2011 in particular. But you can also see there's parts of Australia, like, that poor southwestern Australia part in 2010, 2011 also missed out. So as we know, Australia is a land of extreme droughts and floods, and we go through these various climate cycles. And we're interested in how these change over time. On this bottom panel is the sort of Southern Oscillation Index, as well as the Inter-Pacific Oscillation. And you can see, or Indo-Pacific Oscillation or Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and you can see these 20 to 30 year cycles in the record as well, where we go from more wetter climates to drier climates, and it looks like we're starting to emerge into a wetter period at the moment. How does that? We can see this variable climate imprinted on the Burdekin River discharge history. So we've had a continuous flow gauge measuring discharge every 15 minutes at the Burdekin River Home Hill Clare area since 1921-22 water year. So this is a water year. Water years start in October, 1st of October, finish at the 30th of September. So this is a 104-year record of annual Burdekin discharge. Here's from 0 to 60 million megalitres here. Why do we care about the Burdekin? Well, the Burdekin is the biggest river by average discharge volume in Australia. So it's the real deal, the Burdekin. And we've done a lot of work in this catchment because it also is the biggest contributor of sediment loads to the Great Barrier Reef as well. So those of you who like that sort of trivia, the biggest flood year for the Burdekin in terms of total annual discharge is 53 million megalitres in that really big 1973-74 season. We had the second is 1990-1991 with about 40 million megalitres. That extreme 2010-2011 season is third with about 34 million megalitres. And in fourth place was 2024-2025 with 30.6 million megalitres. So you can see often some of these wetter periods come in clumps of multiple years as well. Now, I've also put in the Burdekin Falls Dam there. The capacity of the Burdekin Falls Dam is 1.86 million megalitres. That was constructed in 1987. If we look at the average annual discharge for that about 65-year period prior to the dam construction, the average discharge is 8.8 million megalitres. Following the dam, the 40 years roughly since is 9.3 million megalitres. So in terms of annual average annual discharge from the Burdekin, the averages haven't really changed over these two different periods and haven't been really influenced by the dam. However, if we look at the daily discharge of the Burdekin, so now this is now going from annual water year discharge to discharge every day from 0 to 3 million megalitres per day, you can immediately see since the Burdekin Dam has come in, there's been quite a big change there. So particularly flow events over 2 million megalitres per day, that would happen roughly 1 in 15 years prior to the Burdekin Dam coming into place. In the last 40 years of the Burdekin Falls Dam, we have not seen a flow event in daily discharge above 2 million megalitres. So this shows us that the Burdekin Dam is actually attenuating those big daily peaks in the floods. So it's having some flooding control in the areas downstream of the dam. Although in terms of annual discharge, it hasn't had much of an influence. Can we extend these records? Well, yes, we can. We can actually use these coral cores. Right, so we look at these Porites corals that are brain corals. They can live for several hundreds of years. They lay down annual growth rings like trees do, and they're essentially growing their skeleton out of the surrounding seawater. So they're preserving all those conditions that they're growing in. We can measure certain chemistry and physical parameters on these corals that tell us anything from river discharge to seawater temperature to changes in river exposure over time. And this is what the cores look like. We take a slice of those cores, we put them under an ultraviolet light, and we can reconstruct discharge. So this is what they look like when we put them under an ultraviolet light, and you can see these yellow lines glow out of the coral. They're quite spectacular when you look at them. This was a core from Havana Island, which is in the Palm Island group, just north of Townsville. And this area receives regular runoff flood discharge from the Burdekin River. This core was taken in 2012. This is the top of the core up here. Hopefully you can see the arrow on my screen, where you can see this big flood event in 2010, 2011 at the top of the core. Not so big event in 2010. Really big flood again in 2009. Another big flood in 2008. Reasonable flood in 2007. And then we have these lower flow periods here. Then you can see the big 1991 discharge event here, 1979, 1981. So essentially you can get your eye in the coral and you can put your finger on those big flood events. And this coral record from the Havana Island actually goes back to 1648. So we can reconstruct Burdekin River discharge going back over 350 years from 1648 here to 2011. So this is now the annual discharge using the coral core records from 0 to 50 million megalitres. And you can see quite a big shift from about 1850 with those bigger flood years coming in. If we did the statistics on this, above the arrow, these are the annual discharge over 100-year intervals, and the last interval's about 60 years. So this is 1650 to 1750, about 7.2 gigalitres or 7. Oh, sorry, I should say I've got this wrong. This should be teralitres. I meant to change this. So this is 7.2 million megalitres, 5.4 million megalitres, 8.6 million megalitres, and 9.5. So you can see from about 1850, we've gone up by 1 to 2 million megalitres on average for Burdekin flow. And this is really evident in that 90th percentile. So this range here is the 10th percentile, the first number, which is the lowest 10 flow years of the 100-year records. Then we go into the 90th percentile, which is those upper 10 years. And you can see in the 90th percentile, you know, from 1650 to 1850 was sitting around 10 to 12 million megalitres. Now we've almost doubled that to 17 to 22 million megalitres. So it's been quite a big shift. How does this compare to other parts in Northern Australia? Well, there's a recent study that's come out reconstructing the daily river discharge now using tree ring reconstruction records. And this is the paper here. And lo and behold, they see a very similar pattern to what we see in the coral luminescence record that I just showed you then, where we've seen very big changes in river discharge, particularly in this record over the last 50 years. And this has been linked to an intensification of the Indo-Australian monsoon. How does this influence the sediment load records from the Burdekin River? Well, we've managed to monitor sediment loads almost annually since the Burdekin Dam's been constructed. But even prior to the Burdekin Falls Dam, we've had a couple of years where the hydrographers have been monitoring the flow events very well, so we can reconstruct sediment loads for this really big 73, 74 year where we had over 30 million tonnes of sediment coming out of the river. I don't think we would see something like that happen again since the Burdekin Falls Dam's been in place, because the Burdekin Dam captures about 88% of the catchment area and it traps about 60% of the bulk suspended sediment coming in from the upstream area. So since the dam's been constructed, you know, the biggest sediment loads coming out of the mouth are around that 15 million tonnes that we saw in about the 1991 flood and the 2007-2008 flood. But what we see on this record, which is really interesting, is the influence of the drought-breaking floods, right? So we had severe drought in the Burdekin from the early to mid-1990s. And the drought-breaking flood there, we produced about 7 million tonnes of sediment coming out of the river following that long drought period. Then we plunged back into drought in the Burdekin called the Millennium Drought in the early 2000s. And the catchment took a while to recover again. And we saw big sediment loads coming out in 2006, 2007, 2007-08, nearly 15 million tonnes in that one. And the bigger flood, 2008, 2009, around 10 million tonnes. But here's 2010, 2011. And in terms of annual discharge, I've just showed you, this was a much bigger event, well, a bigger event by discharge than these previous two. But we had about just over 5 million tonnes of sediment coming out. So you can see the influence of the changing in the catchment condition, the better ground cover, the wetter the catchment, we've got better cover, so there's lower sediment loads coming out. And I'm really sweating on the load for 24-25. We haven't got that yet, but it's coming pretty soon, hopefully. But we haven't seen those major droughts since the Millennium Drought. So it looks like these loads are starting to come down, and hopefully we can sort of stay out of the drought and we can manage those drought years a little bit better into the future too. So I suppose looking at the big picture in the Burdekin, this is us compiling the climate and environmental change in the Burdekin. So this is a record time series, and I'm sorry you probably can't see this, but this is a time series from 1850 through to 2020. And this captures the variability in rainfall, annual river discharge using the gauge, and then prior to that, the luminescent lines, the population, the cattle and sheep numbers in the Burdekin catchment, the mining, the cropping. And here's how they correlate to some of those coral records. So these are the geochemistry records now in the corals that tell us other information about catchment runoff as well over time, and how that influences sediment loads and the records of sediment cores and things like that coming back. So I guess the point there is as our climate is changing and appearing shifting towards these bigger annual discharge years, the catchment is also, has that land use pressure as well that we have to manage, which Jack will start to talk about in this next presentation. So finally on the Burdekin, what can we really do about it? Well, we've actually also zoomed in on the Burdekin catchment area a little bit further. So we've looked at the major tributaries of the Burdekin and looking at the major sediment contributing areas of the catchment. So these are the four major tributaries upstream of the Burdekin Falls Dam. And this is the less than 10 micron fraction. So the really fine sediment loads coming out of these different areas. So this is the upper Burdekin, is the big sediment contributor upstream. We now understand the trapping of sediment in the Burdekin Falls Dam. So this finer fraction is about 50% of that sediment is trapped by the dam. And then we've got that lower area. So from these budgets, we're able to say, on average, 60% of the sediment load is coming from that catchment area below the dam, which is only about 12% of the catchment area. So that's where we can start targeting our investment. Now, this is a bit of a mistake, I have to confess, because we sort of missed that upper Burdekin there with the trapping of the dam. But in those really big flood years, the big sediment loads are coming from that upper part of the catchment. It's probably more 60 to 70% of the sediment load up there compared to 30% or so downstream. So we still need to manage those two big sediment areas. But based on that information, the 60% from 12% of the catchment area, and we also had other information where we, with my other colleague, Zoe Bainbridge, who ran the community water quality monitoring, where Graziers collected samples from their finer tributaries within the Burdekin, and we're able to see where the biggest sediment sources were coming from in those two big contributing catchment areas, in the upper Burdekin and in the Triple B. We didn't have, or that area below the dam, which we also call the Triple B, the Bowen Broken Bogey catchment. But we didn't have too many samplers in that area below the dam. So with the North Queensland Dry Tropics, they run the Landholders Driving Change project. We established some more monitoring teams of local volunteers collecting samples from this area below the dam, where we can start to refine these sediment budgets in the catchment. Also, sediment tracing can also be done on this work, where we can see that most of the sediment is coming from subsurface sources, which are likely derived from gully erosion. And from this sources, we've started having investment in this area of the Burdekin to remediate some of these large gullies in the catchment. So this is a big gully in the Strathalbyn complex, and Greening Australia have been out and they've, basically filled that gully in, reshaped the land and modified it. So there's virtually very little sediment now coming off from these big gully networks. And unfortunately, the writing's covering the car for scale. Other big areas are Mount Wickham, and there's been a lot of other gully remediation sites occurring in this part of the catchment as well. So yeah, so some really neat things happening. Really great to see on-ground investment to improve our landscape and reduce the sediment loads going out from the stream. So from there, I'll leave it and pass you over to Jack.
Thanks very much, Steve. Just checking you can see my screen and hear me.
Yep, all good, Jack.
Excellent, thanks. Well, thank you. So Steve's presented a really nice overview of the longer term history of flooding and droughts across northern Queensland. What I'd like to do today is dive a bit deeper into one particularly significant flooding event that impacted large swathes of northwest Queensland. I'm of course talking about the event that occurred in 2019. I'm sure many people on the call today would probably remember seeing some of those pretty confronting images from that time of hundreds of dead livestock piled up along fence lines, major damage to the road and rail network, and also property infrastructure. It really had a major impact. Right across that landscape, we saw very severe soil erosion across widespread areas, stripping away that topsoil and taking with it valuable nutrients, seed bank, and also ripping out pasture plants. In other areas of this landscape, often in the lower lying areas, we saw significant deposition of sediment and silt, smothering pasture plants and also contributing to pasture death. So with that somewhat bleak outlook, I guess what I want to do today is briefly introduce this event and go over some of the key things we've learned in terms of its impact on soil and pasture condition, but most importantly, management and recovery out of these events. And before I jump into the detail, I guess just a little bit more background, and Steve's already touched on this, but really just wanting to highlight that Australia and Northern Australia in particular really is a land of extremes with very high interannual rainfall variability. And these extreme climatic events, droughts and floods, do occur quite frequently in this landscape. To illustrate that, this plot is showing the difference in annual rainfall from the long-term median rainfall at the town of Julia Creek, which is one of the focus areas for what I'll present today. And what it's showing is basically we have periods of time where we've got rainfall well above the long-term median, shown by the blue bars, and periods of time where rainfall is well below that long-term median. Now, Northern Australia's graziers, pastoralists are generally pretty well adapted to dealing with the year-to-year variability in rainfall, but it's this occurrence of extreme climate events, often in quick succession, that presents some major land management challenges. And as Steve's already alluded to, it's quite common for extended dry periods or drought to be immediately followed by or broken by intense rain and flooding. And what happened in 2019 is a really good example of this. So in late January and early February of 2019, large parts of northwest Queensland, in particular the Flinders catchment, experienced 10 consecutive days of very intense rainfall. At Julia Creek, for example, over those 10 days, we had around 571 mils fall, with a peak daily total of about 229 mils. The long-term average annual rainfall at Julia Creek is just 460 mils. So in that 10-day period, we had more than the long-term average received. Now, this intense and unprecedented rainfall then triggered widespread flooding right across the catchment. It's estimated that around 2.3 million hectares of land was inundated. That's shown by this darker shade of blue here. And some of those areas, inundated areas, spanned around 70 kilometers east to west and over 400 kilometers north to south. So effectively returning this area to an inland sea. Now, what's really important to note here is that this estimate of 2.3 million hectares likely greatly underestimates the true flooding extent. And that's because the best available flood mapping at the time was only available after the peak of the event had passed. And so we have other estimates which are suggesting a much, much larger area, around 13 million hectares, shown by this lighter shade of blue, was in fact impacted by this extreme flooding event. Now, what's really important to note here with this particular flood was that in the 6 or so years immediately before the flood, we had average to well below average rainfall conditions, and large parts of the catchment were actually drought declared. We then had the flood in late January, early February, but then in the weeks, months, and years following that flood event, we actually had very little follow-up rainfall, and those parts of the catchment still remain drought declared. It wasn't until 22, 4, and this past wet season that we've started to return to higher than average rainfall conditions. So why is this important? Well, Steve's again already alluded to this, but during drought, the vulnerability to experiencing severe impacts associated with flooding events is greatly increased. This increased vulnerability is largely associated with the reduction in vegetation cover and biomass that can arise as a result of the, I guess, combined effects of prolonged low rainfall, but also in these grazed landscapes, a tendency to graze and overgraze through that dry period to get through those times. Now, in terms of the 2019 flood, when we look at a regional catchment scale, we can see that large parts of the catchment in the months just before the flood were classified as having either bare or a mix of bare and non-green vegetation. Straight after the flood, in March, April, May, we had an explosion of vegetation growth. But by September of that same year, we'd largely returned to the conditions of 2018, if not a little bit worse off in terms of the cover conditions. And this persisted for the next few years. It wasn't until we started getting that higher rainfall over the last couple of years that we've started to see improvements in ground cover at those regional scales. So what impact did this flood actually have? Well, I've already touched on this already, but it's important to note here that the impacts weren't just as a result of the flood, but for this particular event, an associated wind chill event also occurred where temperatures were greatly reduced and there was extreme wind passing through, which contributed to the very significant death of livestock. Over 500,000 head of livestock were lost. And as I've already touched on, very significant damage to infrastructure. One of the longer lasting impacts of this particular event was the impact it had on the soil and pasture resources. As I said, we saw widespread erosion of topsoil, but we also had the formation of gullies and very large gullies, particularly in areas close to major drainage lines. In other areas, as I said, we had that deposition of sediment and silt smothering the pasture plants and contributing to their death. But also, because this is a very flat landscape, it takes a while for those floodwaters to move out. And so we had prolonged inundation, up to 10 days or more in some areas. And this inundation also contributed to the loss of pasture. So overall, a very significant event, both in aerial coverage, but also the impact it had. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily isolated in its occurrence. We've had some smaller magnitude floods in the Flinders over the past few years, but perhaps most significantly and most recently is the large floods which have moved through southwest Queensland earlier this year. Globally, these wet and dry extremes are seeming to become more frequent, more intense. And so with that in mind, I guess it's really important that we start to untangle what are these factors which influence both the impact of these climate extremes on our agricultural and rangeland landscapes, but importantly, how do we manage and build resilience in these systems to aid in their recovery? So I'm just going to quickly go over a small study that we completed last year, which was looking at recovery in grazing land condition, focus on the Mitchell Grass Downs land type, which is a really important land type for grazing throughout this region, and look at that recovery in the 5 or so years since this event. To do this, we've drawn on some historical data. So immediately following the flood, or as soon as those floodwaters receded, staff from the Department of Primary Industries, principally Trevor Hall and Jenny Milson, pictured here, got out and did a rapid assessment of soil and pasture condition at around over 100 sites throughout the catchment. And then they followed that up in August of the next year. In September of 2024, we went and revisited a number of those sites. So we got to about 62 of the original surveyed sites, and we assessed another 14 new sites. And we were very lucky to bring both Trevor and Jenny back out for this trip. What are we looking at? Well, we're basically trying to assess grazing land conditions. So people on the call today might be familiar with the standard framework that's used in Queensland, where land condition is broken into A, B, C, or D, with A being the best condition, very high coverage of what we call 3P grasses, perennial, productive, and palatable, few weeds, few signs of erosion, and very high productive capacity, whereas D condition is the opposite of that. So what did we find? Well, in one slide, in that 2024 survey, we found that land condition had improved at least one condition score at 30 of the sites we visited, so about 48%, remained the same at 29 sites, around 47%, and went backwards or declined at least one condition score at 3 of the sites. And the distribution of those changes is shown in this map. So as I said, at a lot of sites, we actually saw an improvement in land condition. To give an example of that, this particular site was very heavily impacted by the 2019 flood, with complete loss of pasture cover and very intense scouring of the soil surface. Excuse me. In 2024, the site's shown a somewhat remarkable recovery with very good coverage of Mitchell grass, which is the dominant preferred species out that way. And it's really a good news story that you can see, despite these impacts, such recovery. But it's really important to note here that this just doesn't happen. It really needs to be supported by very careful grazing land management in those weeks, months, and years following the event. After an event, and when a landscape is in this kind of condition, it is very fragile and susceptible to further impacts. The couple of recent years of very good summer rainfall has no doubt also aided in the recovery. On the other hand, despite receiving good recent summer rainfall, we found that some sites had not improved in condition and remained at that C or D level. Now, this suggests that grazing has probably continued above the carrying capacity for that landscape, which meant that recovery was just not possible. There could be other factors at play here around soil, physical, and chemical constraints, which might be inhibiting pasture growth, or there could be a loss of the seed bank as a result of the flooding. We weren't able to assess this in this study, but there are other factors that complicate the overall story. What we found also was that where tussocks, so Mitchell grass is a tussock plant, where the tussocks had been grazed down to 10 centimeters or less prior to the flood, often there was very little to no recovery, but where 20 to 30 centimeters of that stem had remained prior to those floodwaters moving through, recovery was often much higher. Again, a big management effect. And you can see that in this aerial image here, where we've got very clear fence line effects, despite the flood effect being the same, the impact on the land is obviously very different. So take-home messages from this work is firstly that land in good condition, or that's maintained to be in as good a condition as possible, is much more resilient to the impacts of extreme climate events, both floods and droughts, and tend to recover more quickly. We saw significant improvement in land condition at many of the sites that were heavily impacted by the 2019 flood, but this recovery has to have been supported by very careful grazing management and also aided by the good rainfall in recent years. And lastly, we're currently undertaking more research to try and untangle what some of those other key factors are, which are more specifically influencing the impact of flooding on rangeland condition and those recovery trajectories and implications for management. I'd just like to very quickly acknowledge Trevor and Jenny for generously donating their time to come back out and redo these surveys. It shows a great passion from them for this environment and this landscape. Southern Gulf NRM, who we partnered with on this project, and we're working with Southern Gulf on a range of other projects across Northwest Queensland, all focused on improving grazing land conditions. Queensland DPI for having the foresight to commission that post-flood survey, and it really shows the value of making those investments so we can track changes through time. And of course, the landholders who enabled us access onto their properties to collect this data and for sharing their insights about what their stories were with the flood and recovery. And lastly, the work's funded through the TNQ Drought Hub, through the Future Drought Fund. I'd just like to say thanks particularly to David Phelps as well, who's spent a career out in this landscape and provided some really valuable insights into interpreting what we were seeing. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions later.
Righto, shifting on Aaron. Aaron, you want to share and kick off?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Can you see that?
Yep, you're going to go full screen though.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for that, Jack. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Aaron. I'm going to be giving a bit of a presentation today that probably takes a little bit of a different perspective or focus to the themes that Jack and Steve have been looking at about those longer term decadal scale fluctuations in climate. I'm going to be looking at the interactions or the variability in weather and the management challenges that it poses for particularly intensive agriculture in the form of cane farming in Australia's wet tropics. I'm going to be talking predominantly today about fertiliser losses, so fertiliser applied to sugarcane paddocks. I'm going to be using terms like dissolved inorganic nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen somewhat interchangeably throughout the presentation, but they both mean the same thing, loss of fertiliser. And I want to make some initial key points that climatic extremes are certainly important and a real management challenge for farmers and subsequent water quality. And I'll expand on some of those towards the end of the presentation. But in a lot of ways, I think it's variability in weather, and often in a fairly short-term weather window, just of 2 or 3 months in many cases, that really drives or dictates the loss of fertiliser from paddocks in rain-fed wet tropical sugarcane farming contexts in northern Australia. To set a bit of a framework or background for what I'll be talking today, this is a bit of a simplified conceptual model of, I guess, a perfect or an ideal planned rollout in the timing of farming practices on a wet tropics cane farm. Obviously, doesn't happen in the real world, but I've used the monthly rainfall data from Babinda, which is one of the areas in the wet tropics we've done a lot of work over the last 5 to 10 years as sort of the foundation. But it's obviously one of the wetter places in northern Australia. But the general trends and patterns that we see in water quality and farming and things like that are fairly consistent across different similar areas of northern Queensland. So in a typical or a perfect start to a sugar season for a cane farmer, he'd be harvesting his crop, or the cane crush as you'll often hear it referred to, ideally between sort of August and November. He'll be doing his plant cane fertilizations probably between August to September, and then he's return cropping from August probably through to the end of November in an ideal world. The important thing to appreciate there is that the fertilisation or application of fertiliser, it really goes out for all intents and purposes in just one fell swoop in many ways for farmers on most paddocks of their farm. And it's really weather variability in quite a specific window, so that you can see in red here. So this probably time frame from September to maybe December, that few months there, the timing and magnitude of rainfall, that really drives the sort of subsequent nature and scale of fertiliser losses that we'll see from a particular paddock where fertiliser's been applied. To give you a bit of a visual perspective of how nitrate nitrogen or fertiliser loss often looks in these rainfall dominated wet tropic sugarcane subcatchments, I've got an example here from one of our long-term monitoring sites near Babinda from the 2019-2020 wet season. So a few years ago now. There's a picture of our monitoring site at the top left of the slide there. You can see the cane drain that we're monitoring, sort of in a I guess, moderate to major flood there. The instrument that we're collecting all of this data with is in the bottom left there. It's a nitrate sensor. They're kind of an emerging, somewhat cutting-edge technology, but they're pretty amazing in that they allow us to calculate a nitrate nitrogen concentration in the water in that drain every 15 minutes, 365 days a year. And the data set, they produce this data set that you can see here. So this red trace that you can see on the slide here for one particular wet season from December to May, that's our nitrate nitrogen concentration in milligrams per litre. And that blue trace you can see there is simply the stream height in metres in that drain that you can see on the top left of the slide there. And just some indicative rainfall totals associated with some of those rainfall runoff events that are occurring through the over the course of that wet season as it sort of builds up in terms of rainfall magnitude. But one really obvious thing that you can see here is that you get this quite rapid decrease or attenuation, not quite exhausting in your nitrate nitrogen concentrations from those first 2 or 3 events of the wet season. They don't exhaust entirely, they sort of tail off. You've still got things happening in some of the big wet season months like February and March. Here, mineralisation of fertiliser and loss from the catchment. But if we calculate a load through time for this particular year and events, you'll find that about more than half of your fertiliser's already left the paddock before or the subcatchment before you get to those really big wet season months. So a lot of that, the inorganic nitrogen load or the fertiliser load for the year's gone before the wet season proper starts in many years. And this is quite a consistent pattern that we see at this particular site, just some data from subsequent years, very similar patterns that you see happening there, maybe some slight variations. But it's also a pattern that we tend to see in other wet tropics cane farming situations. So another graph here, fairly similar depiction of data with the top two wet seasons from the Tully-Johnson catchment and the bottom two from some of our longer term monitoring sites around the Lower Herbert and Ingham. And I've got slightly different data depiction here. That red dotted line there is our cumulative nitrate nitrogen load flux as it develops through time over the course of the wet season. And the clear thing that you can see there in nearly all of these examples is a dominant proportion of that nitrate nitrogen load loss, for lack of a better word, is occurred in those first 2 to 3 events. And then it just sort of tails off and just sort of increases slowly through time. It almost doesn't matter how much rain you're having in the later stages of the wet season. Now, another way to look at this, and I've borrowed this from, I guess, a bit of urban stormwater runoff pollution management analysis and theory in first flush analysis. And you can generate for our sugarcane catchment data these MV curves, which just basically plot the proportion of your pollutant mass loss over the course of a wet season, in this case, inorganic nitrogen, against the cumulative or your normalized runoff volume over the course of that wet season. And in a perfect, if you're getting directly proportionate pollutant loss, so 1-to-1 in terms of proportions over the course of a year, you get a 45-degree line that looks like this, which they call uniform loss dynamics. There's obviously variations of this. You can have a first flush loss dynamic, and that's where the majority of your pollutant export occurs in the early stages of your wet season runoff event. I've just highlighted a point there on the graph there where at 0.6 or 60% of the inorganic nitrogen load there has left in the first 20% of the wet season and then sort of tends to tail off towards the end of the wet season. You can get the opposite effect, a lagging effect, where the majority of your pollutant export occurs later in your flow events or your wet season, and you can get these various permutations and combinations and mixed loss dynamics through time. But what happens when we plot all of those MV curves from sugarcane dominated catchments? They produce something that looks much like this. It's all of those red curves that you can see there are from 15 to 20 years of data across different sites and subcatchments. All of them are, or almost all of them are displaying some sort of level of what you would technically call a first flush each year. And the magnitude can certainly vary. And that varies according to the site itself or between sites, but also within the site itself, depending on the year. And a lot of that variation that we see within sites is driven by a combination of or interaction between weather and the timing of on-farm practices, specifically when most of the fertiliser is going out and being applied in those catchments. And just to highlight some of those points at the upper left of the slide there, where you're seeing quite significant or strong first flush effects, they're often driven by situations that we know of where quite a bit of fertiliser has gone out in a particular subcatchment, and then it's been followed often with unpredicted, 100, 150 millimetre rainfall events, which certainly aren't extreme in the context of rainfall and weather up in the wet tropics. But, sometimes they're occurring in October and November and a little bit out of season. And you can really see you don't need extreme events to produce high DIN load first flushes in a lot of situations. The timing of that rainfall in relation to when that farmer put the fertiliser out in the paddock and catchment is a really key driver. Just to provide a little bit of QA/QC or another line of evidence, I guess, to that data, this is a very similar statistical approach applied to paddock scale data in this case, and the data itself is courtesy of Tony Webster, an agronomist at CSIRO, who's done a lot of work in sugarcane over the last 10 to 15 years in the wet tropics. And it's basically exactly the same statistical approach. And what you can see there is even at the scale of a sugarcane paddock, in terms of our DIN runoff dynamics from that paddock, we're getting a very similar pattern to what we're seeing at a subcatchment scale. So some level of first flush every year, and the majority of your fertiliser nitrogen is actually leaving the paddock in what you'd probably think of the early stages of the wet season before it really kicks off. Just gives us a little bit more confidence in the data that we were seeing at a catchment level. It's also interesting, I think, to probably step back and look at what's happening at a broad spatial scale in a catchment here, with all of those sort of variable effects happening at different farms across a catchment during a wet season. And I've got some data here from some of our monitoring work in the Lower Herbert River catchment near Ingham, one of our really important cane farming districts just north of Townsville here. And it's a wet season heat map depicting our dissolved inorganic nitrogen losses or exports per hectare per year across 9 different monitoring sites that are sort of arrayed along the vertical axis there. The very bottom site that you can see there, it's actually a rainfall reference site in case you're wondering. But I don't want people to get too bogged down in the specific numbers here. It's more the colour coding and what happens from year to year. But you can see it can be very complex, and you almost get this mosaic of hotspots in space and hotspots in time. You might look at a particular year like 23-24 wet season, which was quite a wet one and a wet crush leading into the wet season itself. There tended to be this general trend across the catchment towards higher average DIN load losses from those sugarcane catchments, but it certainly wasn't consistent. And you get these odd catchments here and there that exported higher amounts in previous years, but this was their lowest ones on record. And a lot of that variation that we see there, that complexity, it's due to that interaction again between weather and the timing of on-farm practices in those particular subcatchments. And you can often see instances of high dissolved inorganic nitrogen losses in below average years, just due to that timing of when that actual rainfall occurs in relation to the fertiliser application. And also vice versa, you can have big wet seasons, but if they're a late wet season, you often don't get as high a loss. One of the common findings that we do get in this sort of broad scale work is that when you have a poor wet season for water quality, it's almost invariably followed by a poor cane crop. So, a poor year for cane production. So across the district, the tonnages are down, the sugar's down. And the simple fact is the fertiliser nitrogen that the farmers put out just isn't making it into the sugarcane where he wants it. It's being lost to the environment either as runoff, which I've been showing here, deep drainage, maybe volatilisation and gaseous losses. But those wetter years also have a number of other long-term impacts or challenges for farmers. You can have a wet crush. You can see some pictures up there of cane harvesting occurring during wet weather. All sorts of vehicle track damage to paddocks. Lots of compaction, which has long-term impacts on cane productivity. They can knock the stool around, damage the root systems. In these wet seasons, you often get months of overcast weather, which obviously isn't great for the cane in terms of promoting its growth and taking the nitrogen that's been applied out of the soil. So these wet seasons can have a long-term legacy effect as well. And to tie back into the timing of extreme events, I'm just going to use an example here of some of the impacts of ex-tropical cyclone Jasper on, or the impacts it had for cane farmers, both in the short and long term in that Mulgrave Russell area near Gordonvale where I work. A lot of you probably remember Cyclone Jasper. It was only a couple of years ago, a Category 2 when it crossed the coast, but was probably the wettest cyclone in recorded Australian history, like over 2 metres of rain dropped in some places. You can see some pictures from the slide here around Gordonvale and Cairns. This is what it looked like in terms of the monthly rainfall totals. It occurred really early in a wet season, sort of mid-December 2023, and got well over a metre of rain essentially within a couple of days, which was well above what you see as sort of the 100-year December average for the Mulgrave Mill Bureau of Meteorology rain gauge that's been running there for a very long time. So really an extreme event in terms of its timing. And if you think back to that management practice framework that I showed earlier about the timing of things and what's happening on the sugarcane paddocks around this time, fertiliser's gone out, you've just had crop harvests and things like that. There's a lot of damage in the short term from the flooding, knocking cane over and things like that. But because it was so early in the year, it had even bigger impacts in some ways. So a lot of the cane was small, late plant cane, recently harvested cane, inundated by water, tons of trash dumped over paddocks, waterlogged for days. If it had been more mature cane, a metre or two high, it probably would have got through a lot of that a lot easier. But, that smaller cane doesn't really like getting its feet wet. And there was quite widespread damage on a lot of the river flat country and those low-lying farms through the area. And in fact, it killed a lot of that small cane. So there's lots of long-term implications now, or management decisions that those farmers have to make around, do I plough it out and start from scratch? Do I just replant in those sort of really damaged sections of paddocks? You tend to get these short-term acute effects, but also these really long-term impacts where it might take a whole crop cycle, another 5 years for a farmer to sort of work his way through it. So to start wrapping up with a few key messages, farmers obviously can't control the weather, but there are a few key management principles, I guess, that they can follow to minimise the risk. Not totally remove the risk, but minimise it, the potential for fertiliser loss from their paddocks. Getting your fertilizer rate right's very important. There's a bit of a saying going around. I can't remember who to give it credit to, but the saying that the last kilo that you put on is the first kilo that you lose. So, optimizing your fertilizer rate's important. Timing is something that we've had quite a bit of success with farmers around the Russell Mulgrave now. We're showing them this sort of data. A lot of them have tried to get their fertilizer on a little bit earlier in the year now, straight after harvest in some ways, just to give it more opportunity time for the crop to uptake that fertilizer before you start getting your first rainfall and runoff events for the wet season. Certain crop stages are definitely more vulnerable from the looks of things. Plant crops with not very well developed root masses can't uptake a lot of fertilizer for quite a while. They look a little bit more susceptible to high losses than later fallow crops. An area a farmer has to be pretty switched on with. And also particularly important is things like placement. So getting their fertilizer under the ground instead of a surface application, for example, in a lot of scenarios there, that minimises that risk of getting that sort of somewhat unpredicted 100 millimetre rainfall event in September or October or November that can wash a lot of their fertiliser away. So they can reduce their risk, but they certainly can't remove it entirely. It's just sort of, an ongoing management challenge in those sort of systems. So just a couple of key wrap-up points. Extremes in climate are certainly a challenge for cane farming. So the acute event itself, the acute impacts and its longer-term legacy impacts, which it can extend for a whole crop cycle in some cases. But on that year-to-year variability, it's year-to-year basis, I think it's that weather variability. So that sort of rainfall that they get in that 2 or 3 month window between probably September to December, that really drives the nature and scale of their DIN losses for the year. And it's the timing of that rainfall and runoff in relation to those key farm events like their fertiliser application. That's a real management challenge. And there's not a lot of easy answers at some levels for farmers in that space. And yeah, just sort of acknowledge a lot of this data that I've presented here is sort of a compilation of a whole range of funding bodies at different levels of Queensland and Australian government and some long-term projects, which we're obviously very grateful for. But I'll leave it at that and hopefully open the floor up for questions with Steve.